Coming up on the program today, violence between the Israeli military and Palestinian militants escalates, raising fears of a war. Russians pay tribute to those killed in the school shooting in Kazan city. Plus, an independent panel of the World Health Organization says the COVID-19 pandemic was preventable. Glad you could join us at this hour. I am Amarachi Ubani. We begin with a deadly exchange of fire still ongoing between Israel and the Palestinian militants in the Gaza Strip, with the United Nations fearing this could escalate into full-blown war. More than 1,000 rockets have now been fired by the Palestinian militants in over 38 hours, and most of them have been directed at Tel Aviv. As many as 53 Palestinians have been killed in the airstrikes from Israel, though with 6 Israelis also dead. Explosions rocked Gaza earlier this morning as airstrikes targeted the city following a night of escalating hostility between Israel and the Islamist group Hamas. Israel says its jets had targeted and killed several of the group's members following the airstrikes. Other strikes targeted what the military says were rocket launch sites at Hamas offices. The Israeli city of Tel Aviv has been the most hit by the strikes from Hamas. On Tuesday night, residents of the city ran for shelter as sirens sounded after Hamas and the Islamic Jihad group said they would fire rockets in response to an earlier strike by Israel that hit a 13-story residential block in the Gaza Strip. The block, which housed an office used by the political leadership of the enclave's Islamist rulers, collapsed after being hit. 3 people were wounded in a retaliatory attack from Gaza on Tel Aviv. Hours earlier, Israel had sent 80 jets to bomb Gaza and massed tanks on the border as rocket barrages hit Israeli towns for a second day, deepening the conflict. And the death toll on the side of the Palestinians continues to rise. By Wednesday, the Palestinians began burying their dead. And in the city of Jerusalem, Jews cleared Torah scrolls from a torched synagogue and burnt out cars lined nearby streets after violence erupted there. Police arrested dozens of people overnight in Lod and in majority Arab towns in central and northern Israel, including al-Fam along the West Bank border and Jisr al-Zakar on the Mediterranean coast. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the government would use all of its strength to protect Israel from enemies on the outside and rioters on the inside. Fighting between Israel and the Palestinian militants follows weeks of rising tension, stoked by violent confrontations between Israeli police and Palestinian protesters, culminating in clashes at a site in Jerusalem that is holy to both Muslims and Jews. Joining us now is a market entry advisor and business research consultant, Ndudi Osakwe. He joins us from Netanya, which is 30 kilometers north of Tel Aviv in Israel. Mr. Osakwe, thank you for joining us on the program.
Hi, good evening. It's a pleasure being here.
What has the situation been like over the past 24 hours?
Well, the situation has been very dicey here. People are apprehensive and scared a little bit. From last night, as at 9 p.m. yesterday evening, when the Hamas declared that they were going to release some rockets into the cities, it's been very hectic for so many people who are living in Israel here. We had to dash into shelters. Every Israeli home has a protected shelter. And when the siren came on, we had to dash into the safe homes, safe shelters we have in the various apartments.
Wow, that must have been scary. So which places really have been hit by the Palestinian airstrikes?
Well, most of the airstrike actually hit areas close to the southern part of Israel, which is near Ashkelon and the areas close to Gaza. But the surprising thing about the strike compared to other strikes they've had over the years, there was the spread. The spread was quite, I mean, it was like nationwide, and then the frequency also, the frequency of rockets, getting to different parts of the country was amazing. It was something that surprised even the government.
And how are you and your family holding up? Repeatedly hearing these airstrikes, because we hear that the Palestinian militants have sent over 500 airstrikes into Israel.
Well, as at the last count, when I watched the television, when I watched the news, about 1,200 rockets have been launched into Israel, especially towards Tel Aviv area. Netanya is quite a bit far from the area of focus. Yesterday again, I mean, after the first round, at about 2 a.m., that's early this morning, there were other rounds of attack and rocket attack. And since that time till now, although Israelis are out and about doing their businesses, but in areas close to Gaza Strip, and then in areas around Tel Aviv, Holon, Ashkelon, there's still kind of sporadic launches into those cities.
Are you scared that this could go on for the rest of the week? And are you also think that this could escalate into a war?
Well, I think there are concerted efforts by powers. I mean, the United Nations, the Security Council is making efforts to ensure that there's a truce between the parties. And then we have regional powers, Egypt also, and other countries, perhaps UAE, that have just signed an accord with Israel. I'm sure they are making efforts towards making sure that this crisis is brought to an end. It's a bit scary, really, but I think that efforts have been made to ensure that it doesn't escalate into a crisis that will turn to war between the two countries.
Speaking of escalation, Prime Minister Netanyahu hasn't said anything to douse the tensions. He's threatened, or rather he has emphasized Israel's stand to fight into any unrest within Israel as well as outside.
Yeah, I mean, certain things contribute to that. I mean, the government did mention that the Palestinians, that the Hamas militant group actually crossed the red line by targeting Jerusalem. And that thing is pointing, I mean, the frequency of attacks, I mean, the frequency of rockets getting into Tel Aviv and other cities. As a matter of fact, they have the Iron Dome that actually captures some of these rocket launches. But, the frequency which they were being launched, came as a surprise. And, it's very disturbing to the Israeli authority. Moreover, you have cities in Israel where you have both your Jewish people and the Arab people, they live side by side. They call mixed cities, like Lod, Hadera, and there's been some kind of crisis. I mean, there's been some kind of fight between the two people. And this is something that is unprecedented in this country. It's very disturbing to the leaders of the country, and I think they're trying to address that issue as well.
Scary it is, and how disruptive this has been to normal daily life. Ndudi Osakwe, thank you for speaking with us, and do stay safe.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
In the meantime, Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz has condemned the rocket strikes against Israel, saying, with the situation in Israel getting worse, it is of personal importance to me to make clear that we strongly condemn all attacks on Israel, especially the terrorist rocket attacks. Israel has a right to defend itself, and I hope very much that there will be a de-escalation and that the violence against Israel ceases and the attacks and violence against Israel are stopped immediately. Anything else, he says, is a crime against the people of Israel and a massive strain on an already tense region. We're taking a slightly different approach. Britain's Minister for the Middle East, James Cleverly, says the cycle of violence must stop in the region and every effort made to avoid the loss of civilian life, especially that of children. He says while there is no justification for any targeting of civilians, Israel had a legitimate right to self-defense and to defend its citizens from attack.
It is the worst violence seen there for several years. As the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have made clear, this cycle of violence must stop and every effort must be made to avoid the loss of life, especially that of children. The UK offers our deepest condolences to the families of those civilians killed. Civilian deaths, both in Israel and Gaza, are a tragedy. The situation on the ground over the last few days demonstrates the urgent need to make progress towards peace. The UK remains committed to a two-state solution as the best way to bring peace and stability to the region. I repeat again, we urge all sides to show maximum restraint and refrain from taking actions which endanger civilians and make a sustainable peace more difficult.
Many Russians are still shocked at the shooting that happened in the city of Kazan on Tuesday, which left 7 children and 2 adults dead. While the government goes ahead with plans to tighten gun laws, tributes have been pouring in for the victims.
Residents of Kazan showed up today to pay their last respects to the school teacher Elvira Ignatieva, who was killed in Tuesday's school shooting. The media says Ignatieva was shot dead as she was trying to protect the children in the classroom. 9 people, including 7 children, were killed in the attack and many more badly wounded after a lone teenager opened fire in the school. Across the city, people brought flowers, stuffed toys to the school premises, which featured police presence blocking the way to the school. Many people are still in shock. Among government officials paying tribute were Russia's upper house speaker, who attended a makeshift memorial in Moscow. She said school security in the country must be reinforced. Kazan is the capital of the Muslim-majority region of Tatarstan and located around 450 miles east of Moscow. Russia has strict restrictions on civilian firearm ownership, but some categories of guns are available for purchase for hunting, self-defense or sport, once would-be owners have passed tests and met other requirements. The Kremlin says the president has ordered the head of the National Guard to draw up tighter gun regulations. The guards would urgently look into the status of weapons that can be registered for hunting in Russia, but are considering assault weapons elsewhere.
A week on from a deadly train collapse that killed 25 people in the Mexican capital. Scars of the tragedy are still laid bare on the streets of Mexico City as experts work to remove the wreckage and investigate the cause of the collapse. Later Monday, 2 orange carriages plunged into a V shape between the elevator track that had snapped in 2. The train had crashed into a road below, killing 25 people. It was the capital's deadliest metro accident in decades. Mexico has vowed to punish those responsible for the collapse on Mexico City's newest metro line. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has said the investigation should be done quickly and that nothing should be hidden from the public. The city has been governed since the turn of the century by former mayor López Obrador and his allies. You're watching The World Today on Channels Television. Still ahead. Scientists are saying the discovery of the world's oldest burial sites should shed light on early man's emotional abilities. Stay with us. Welcome back into the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we're learning an independent review panel says the pandemic was preventable. A panel set up by the World Health Organization described the combined response of the WHO and global governments as a toxic cocktail. It said the Global Health Agency should have declared a global emergency earlier than it did, and that without urgent change, the world remains vulnerable to another major disease outbreak. Here's more in the Global Update. The review panel set up by the WHO has called for bold reforms and revitalizing national preparedness plans to prevent what it calls another toxic cocktail.
The world was not prepared for this one. it must be prepared and ready for the next. Pandemics are an existential threat to humanity. Yet outside of a crisis, preparedness is all too often relegated to the ministries of health.
In other parts of the world, South Africa, the infection rate is steadily picking up as concerns have grown over 2 new variants of the coronavirus. The dominant B.1.1.7 variant first detected in the UK and the B.1.5.1.7, which sent India's infection rate skyrocketing, have been detected in the country. And in India, the COVID-19 death toll crossed the 250,000 mark, bringing its total tally to 254,197, so says the Health Ministry. As many as 4,205 deaths, the highest so far, were registered during the past 24 hours, marking the country's 21st consecutive day, reporting over 300,000 new cases a day. The total number of confirmed cases reached 23,340,938, after 348,421 new infection cases were reported over the past 24 hours. Nepal has added 9,483 cases and 255 deaths of COVID-19 in 24 hours, both marking the single-day record since the epidemic started in the country. Now the total number of infections stands at 413,111 and deaths at 4,084 in the South Asian country. Finally, Americans abroad are increasingly asking Washington to send surplus coronavirus vaccines to overseas embassies for U.S. citizens in far-flung countries where the pace of inoculation is much slower or access to vaccines is limited. Staying in the United States, the prices at the pump rose to a 6-year record high in the U.S. on Tuesday following the shutdown of the biggest U.S. fuel pipeline due to hackers' attack last Friday, resulting in gasoline supply shortage and panic buying in some regions of the country. On Monday, the third day after the Colonial Pipeline's shutdown, the demand for gasoline in the country increased by 20%, with a total gasoline demand in 5 states, namely Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, increasing by 40.1% due to panic buying. During an interview with China Global Television Network, the president of Lipo Oil Associates pointed out that the major U.S. oil pipeline network remains idle 3 days after the ransomware attack showed the vulnerability of major U.S. fuel enterprises and other vital systems. According to Colonial Pipeline's statement on Friday, it shut down its 5,500-mile pipeline, which carries 45% of diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel on the East Coast. As government steps in, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's administrator, Michael Regan, has issued an emergency fuel waiver on vapor pressure requirements to help alleviate fuel shortages impacted in the United States. This waiver will last until May 18, 2021. And the attorneys representing the family of Andrew Brown, a North Carolina black man who was shot to death last month by sheriff's deputies, said the new police video of his shooting confirms their contention that the killing was unjustified and held some criminal liability. The Brown family and their lawyers viewed 6 new police body cam and dash cam videos on Tuesday in a government building shown to them by officials in Elizabeth City, a riverfront community whose population of roughly 18,000 is half African American. Officials said 42-year-old Brown was fatally shot during a morning raid at his home by sheriff's deputies who tried to serve him with a search and arrest warrant stemming from a felony drug charge.
What we saw on that video was an unjustified killing. What we saw on that video is something that we believe also denotes further investigation and does have some criminal liability.
A Chinese mainland spokeswoman has warned against attempts pushing for the so-called constitutional change in Taiwan, manipulated by a small number of secessionists seeking independence. Spokeswoman for the State Council Taiwan Affairs Office, Zhu Feglian, said at a press briefing that there is only one China in the world, and Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. No matter how the Taiwan independence secessionist forces attempts to distort historical facts or disguise their separatist attempts, they will never be able to change the historical and jurisprudential fact that Taiwan is a part of China, according to her. And as we end the program, the discovery of the oldest known human burial site in Kenya, that dates to around 78,000 years ago for the first time, sheds light on emotional abilities of the early Homo sapiens, according to a Kenyan official. Head of Archaeology at National Museums of Kenya, Dr. Emmanuel Ndiema, says previous archaeological discoveries only help researchers understand technological, sustenance, and environmental aspects of early man's living. Just last week, scientists announced they'd found the oldest known human burial of a young child at a cave site called Panga Ya Saidi near the Kenyan coast. They nicknamed the youngster Mtoto, meaning child in Swahili. A child whose gender remains unclear was placed in the grave in a flexed position, a body lying on its side, with knees drawn toward the chest, according to the researchers who saw it. Dr. Ndiema says the discovery also shows early Homo sapiens living in different parts of Kenya, contradicting a long-standing narrative that suggested early humans only settled in the Rift Valley in Kenya's west.
All this actually, as you see it, is all it was all one piece of mass of encompassing in sediment and very blocky thing. So they were not, this is after actually the preparation in Spain that was able to separate them. Initially we thought it was just another primate and that is it, or a monkey. But then when we brought it here in the lab, and we have our preparation lab just downstairs from where we are now, is when they actually cleaned and they found the first tooth, and they found it was a molar, and there are those guys there that are trained to look at it. They knew it was definitely human, so we were very excited and get engaged.
Well, we never stop learning. Thanks for watching The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani.